February 1974. Deep in the jungles of Lubang Island, Philippines, a young man hiking through the thick undergrowth spots something strange, a figure moving silently among the trees. The man is lean, his uniform tattered, his rifle rusted yet still functional. His eyes are sharp, cautious, trained. When confronted, he doesn't panic or flee. He simply raises his weapon and declares, "I am Imperial Japanese Army Intelligence Officer Hiroo Onoda. The war is not over." But the war had been over for 29 years. The world had changed. Japan had risen from the ashes, cities rebuilt, the atomic bombings were history, and humanity had moved on. Yet for Hiroo Onoda, time had stopped in 1945. Cut off from communication, stranded in the dense Philippine jungle, Onoda had carried out his orders to hold his position, to never surrender, and to fight until told otherwise. Leaflets dropped from planes declaring Japan's surrender were dismissed as enemy propaganda. For nearly 3 decades, Onoda lived as a ghost of the Second World War, hunting for food, sabotaging local farms and evading capture, convinced the emperor still awaited his service. His story is one of unshakable loyalty, delusion, endurance, and the haunting grip of duty that outlasted an empire. This is the incredible true tale of the last soldier of World War II, a man who refused to surrender long after the guns had fallen silent, and whose eventual discovery would stun the world and redefine the meaning of devotion and survival. In the final, desperate months of 1945, the Japanese Empire stood on the edge of collapse. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble by relentless Allied bombing. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were smoldering ruins, the power of the atomic bomb revealing a horror the world had never known. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito prepared to deliver an unprecedented message, the surrender of Japan. For millions, it was the end of an age of sacrifice and fanaticism. But for those scattered across the Pacific, soldiers stranded on islands, in jungles, and behind enemy lines, the emperor's words never came. For them, the war did not end. One of these men was a 22-year-old lieutenant named Hiroo Onoda, born in 1922 in Kainan, Wakayama Prefecture. Onoda had joined the Imperial Japanese Army in 1942, eager to serve his nation in its struggle against the Allied powers. Intelligent and disciplined, he was selected for training as an intelligence officer, a specialist in unconventional warfare, psychological tactics, and survival behind enemy lines. His instructors drilled into him a single unshakable creed: never surrender, never die in vain, and never abandon your mission. To an officer like Onoda, obedience was absolute. In December 1944, as the tide of World War II turned decisively against Japan, Onoda was sent to a small remote island in the Philippines called Lubang. His mission was to disrupt enemy operations, destroy airstrips, sabotage supplies, and collect intelligence. But most importantly, he was ordered to hold out at all costs until he received new instructions. Before departing, his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, gave him one final order that would define his life. Under no circumstances are you to surrender or take your own life. You will continue to fight, even if it takes years. Those words would echo in Onoda's mind for the next 3 decades. When he arrived on Lubang Island, he found chaos. The Japanese garrison was disorganized, morale was low, and supplies were dwindling. American forces were advancing across the Pacific, and the once mighty Japanese Navy was shattered. Within weeks of Onoda's arrival, U.S. troops launched their assault on Lubang. The island's defenders were quickly overwhelmed. Most were killed or captured, but Onoda and a handful of men, including Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Yuichi Akatsu, and Private Kinshichi Kozuka, slipped away into the jungle. As the guns fell silent and American soldiers celebrated victory, Onoda and his group believed the silence was a ruse, a trap to lure them out. They retreated deeper into the forest, setting up small camps, building bamboo shelters, and living off the land. They expected reinforcements or at least further orders, but none came. Then one day leaflets began falling from the sky. They were written in Japanese, announcing that Japan had surrendered and that the war was over. Onoda examined one carefully, holding it under the fading jungle light. He shook his head. "It's a trick," he said. "The enemy is trying to break our will." His men nodded. To them, surrender without direct command was treason. As weeks turned into months and months into years, their conviction hardened. They believed Japan was regrouping, preparing a counterattack that would one day free them. Every sound of a plane overhead was, in their minds, proof that the Imperial Army was returning. Every passing year became another test of faith. They hunted cattle, stole rice, and engaged in skirmishes with local villagers whom they thought were enemy collaborators. Each time they saw soldiers or civilians trying to speak with them, they opened fire. Unknown to them, World War II had been over for years. Japan had surrendered unconditionally on August 15, 1945. Millions of soldiers had returned home. Families mourned their dead, and cities began to rebuild. But deep in the forests of Lubang, Onoda's unit still believed they were part of a living war. They cleaned their rifles daily, performed roll calls, and kept detailed records of their missions. The jungle became both their fortress and their prison. For Onoda, duty was sacred. He was not a fanatic in the ordinary sense. He was a man bound by training, culture, and an unbreakable sense of loyalty. In the Imperial Japanese Army, surrender was considered the ultimate shame. To give up was to disgrace not only yourself but your family and emperor. It was better to die fighting. But Onoda's orders had explicitly forbidden suicide. That paradox, never to surrender, never to die, trapped him in a cycle that time could not break. Back in Japan, Onoda's family presumed him dead. His name was inscribed on a memorial of the fallen. His commanding officers moved on, and the war became a distant memory. Yet for Onoda, the war remained alive in every rustle of the jungle leaves, every distant gunshot, every echo of rain on his makeshift shelter. By the late 1940s, Onoda and his companions had built an entire world within the forest. They patrolled the island as if defending a base, recorded the movements of villagers, and even made small flags to mark their territory. Occasionally, they would find newspapers or magazines that had washed ashore, full of strange new names and inventions that made no sense. They thought it was Allied propaganda designed to confuse them. In 1950, Private Akatsu decided to leave the group, sneaking away under cover of night. When he later surrendered to local authorities and tried to convince Onoda to come out, the lieutenant dismissed him as a traitor. That act deepened Onoda's paranoia. Now even his own comrades could not be trusted. The jungle became timeless. The seasons passed, but for Onoda the mission remained the same. Observe, survive, and wait for orders. He was the embodiment of an empire's ghost, a man still fighting for an emperor who no longer commanded an army. What had begun as a soldier's duty had transformed into a decades-long illusion, one that would outlive the war itself. In the heart of Lubang's jungle, as the world rebuilt and modernized, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda stayed locked in 1945, a lone warrior refusing to surrender, because for him, surrender meant the death of purpose. Life in the jungle was a daily war of endurance, a test that few men could have survived for long. For Hiroo Onoda and the small group of Japanese soldiers who followed him into the dense wilderness of Lubang Island, the line between survival and insanity grew thinner with every passing day. The jungle itself was a living, breathing adversary, humid, tangled, and relentless. Monsoon rains soaked their clothes until the fabric rotted away. Mosquitoes swarmed their bodies at dusk, carrying fever and disease. The men learned to move silently, to blend into the thick undergrowth, to track the movement of patrols and avoid open fields. Every day was governed by the same instinct: endure because surrender was unthinkable. In those early months after the American landing, Onoda's small unit operated with the discipline of trained soldiers. They scavenged weapons and supplies from abandoned Japanese outposts, salvaging rice, bullets, and uniforms. They set up concealed camps near streams and built fires only at night, keeping their smoke hidden beneath the canopy. They studied maps and practiced drills, certain that their actions were contributing to the Empire's greater plan. When they spotted villagers farming near the edges of the forest, they took food and supplies. Believing the locals were enemy collaborators helping the Americans, the jungle became their world and time began to dissolve. Every sunrise looked the same. Every night echoed with the same chorus of crickets and rain. The men hunted wild pigs, gathered coconuts, and rationed rice as if they were still on active duty. When they couldn't find salt, they boiled seawater to make it. Their uniforms, once pristine symbols of imperial discipline, became tattered rags patched with vines and leaves. Yet Onoda insisted on maintaining a strict routine, cleaning rifles, inspecting supplies, and reading from his field manual as if the emperor himself might inspect them one day. Occasionally, aircraft flew overhead, dropping leaflets written in Japanese. The first ones came in late 1945. They were simple. The war ended on August 15th. Come down from the mountains. Onoda examined them carefully under the light of his oil lamp. The paper looked too new, the language too casual. He was convinced they were forgeries, part of an American psychological trick. He told his men, "The enemy is trying to confuse us. Don't believe their lies." They burned the leaflets and moved deeper into the mountains. Years passed and more leaflets came, newspapers, letters, even messages supposedly written by their families. But Onoda could always find reasons to dismiss them. The fonts were wrong. The Japanese writing seemed too westernized. The paper was too smooth. If Japan had truly surrendered, he reasoned, our commanding officers would have sent us an official message, sealed with the proper code. It never occurred to him that his commanders were long gone, or that his nation had changed beyond recognition. Living in isolation took a psychological toll. Every noise in the jungle became a possible threat. Every rustling branch, every distant shout. The men developed rituals to stay focused. They carved bamboo poles into spears, repaired rusted knives, and marked calendar days on tree trunks. When one of them fell ill, they treated him with herbal remedies and prayer. When supplies ran low, they raided nearby villages under cover of darkness, taking food and sometimes clothes. These raids became increasingly violent over the years, as paranoia and desperation deepened. To the villagers of Lubang, Onoda's unit became a terrifying myth. The Japanese ghosts. They would appear suddenly from the jungle, armed and silent, demanding rice and disappearing again into the night. Some villagers tried to reason with them, shouting that the war was long over. But their words only convinced Onoda further that the enemy was spreading propaganda. Several times, police units were sent to search for them, but Onoda's knowledge of guerrilla tactics allowed him to outmaneuver and vanish into the wilderness. By 1949, 5 years after Japan's surrender, most people believed the remaining Japanese stragglers were dead. But Onoda was still alive and still fighting. His small band had dwindled to just 3 men, himself, Corporal Shimada, and Private Kazuka. They continued to treat the villagers as enemy operatives. Onoda kept detailed records of their raids, noting the number of livestock taken and ammunition used. Every action was catalogued as part of their mission report, though there was no one left to receive it. Through the years, nature became both their shelter and their tormentor. The monsoon rains would turn the ground into rivers of mud, flooding their camp and washing away supplies. The dry seasons brought unbearable heat, cracks in the soil, and dehydration. Food became scarce, forcing them to steal from Filipino farmers more frequently, acts that led to small clashes and sometimes bloodshed. Each confrontation only reinforced Onoda's belief that the war continued. "The Americans have turned the locals against us," he wrote in one of his later notes. "We must resist until Japan sends word." As seasons turned into years, Onoda's world shrank to a few square kilometers of jungle and a single unshakable belief. In his mind, Japan remained locked in eternal struggle with the Allied powers. The emperor still reigned and victory was still possible. He and his men were the last outpost of the imperial army, the final defense of a fallen nation. This belief gave him purpose. Without it, the endless rain, the hunger, and the solitude would have broken him. The discipline of a soldier kept him alive, but it also imprisoned him in a reality that no longer existed. To the outside world, Hiroo Onoda was already a relic of the past, but within the jungle, he was still Lieutenant Onoda of the Imperial Japanese Army, holding the line for an empire that had long since vanished into history. As the years turned into decades, the jungle became not just Hiroo Onoda's battlefield, but his entire existence. The mission had consumed his youth, his sanity, and his sense of time. By the early 1950s, the dense forests of Lubang Island had swallowed the last remnants of the Imperial Japanese Army. For Onoda and his remaining comrades, life had narrowed to a cycle of patrols, raids, and waiting. They no longer marked the days or years, only the seasons of rain and heat. To Onoda, This timelessness was not a curse but a duty fulfilled. He was a soldier, and a soldier does not measure time in years, only in service. By 1950, their small group had grown increasingly fractured. Private Akatsu, exhausted by years of hiding, quietly left the camp and turned himself in to Filipino authorities. When Onoda learned that Akatsu had surrendered, he was furious. Not because of betrayal, but because of what he saw as weakness. "A soldier's duty is not to live," he wrote later, "but to obey." Akatsu's surrender convinced him that the Americans were using captured Japanese soldiers to trick the rest into giving up. From that moment on, Onoda's distrust deepened, hardening into complete isolation from the world. Then in 1954, tragedy struck again. During a skirmish with local search parties, Corporal Shimada was shot and killed. Onoda buried his comrade under a palm tree, marking the grave with his bayonet. He and Private Kazuka performed a simple ceremony, bowing in silence. With Shimada's death, the two remaining soldiers swore an oath to continue the fight together. They built a new camp deeper in the mountains and resumed their raids with renewed determination. Over the years, the jungles of Lubang became a living museum of their war, a war that existed only in their minds. Onoda still believed Japan was fighting on. When they came across planes flying overhead, he would look up and say, "Our Air Force is still strong." When they found food tins or modern tools in abandoned huts, he assumed they were Allied equipment, not realizing decades had passed. To Onoda, the world outside had simply frozen in 1945, yet beneath the rigid discipline, loneliness began to seep into his heart. The jungle was silent most nights, except for the insects and the whispering rain. He began to write journals in small, neat handwriting, recording his observations. The movements of locals, the condition of his rifle, and his hopes for Japan's eventual victory. He made notes about the weather and animal behavior, not realizing that his writings would one day become invaluable to historians studying his remarkable isolation. In 1959, tragedy returned once more. Private Kazuka, his last surviving companion, was killed during a clash with local police while burning a farmer's rice harvest, an act they believed would weaken enemy supply lines. Onoda, now completely alone, dragged Kazuka's body into the forest and buried him beneath a simple mound of earth. For the first time in years, he was without a fellow soldier, without another voice to confirm his reality. From that point on, Onoda became a ghost, a man entirely detached from time and civilization. He continued his patrols, moving every few days to avoid capture. He slept beneath makeshift shelters built from palm fronds, his rifle always within reach. He kept his uniform clean, mending tears with vines, and polished his officer's insignia. His sense of identity, of being a soldier of the Emperor, was the last thread connecting him to his humanity. Without that belief, he would have become nothing but another lost soul swallowed by the jungle. For the people of Lubang, Onoda had become legend, the man who would not die. So over the years, locals would glimpse him moving through the trees, always armed, always alert. Stories circulated about a ghost soldier haunting the mountains, attacking livestock and stealing food. He had become both feared and pitied. Government efforts to find him continued sporadically, but every attempt failed. Onoda's knowledge of guerrilla tactics, learned decades earlier, still protected him. He would leave false trails, cross rivers to mask his scent, and camouflage his camp so effectively that even trained trackers walked past them. In Japan, the story of the missing soldier occasionally surfaced in newspapers. Some believed he was still alive. Others dismissed the reports as rumor. The government eventually declared him legally dead. His family mourned him, built a small shrine in his memory, and moved on. Yet deep in the Philippine jungle, the man they grieved still lived and breathed, eating coconuts, cleaning his rifle, and watching the horizon for a command that would never come. Over time, the forest itself seemed to grow around his legend. Hunters claimed to hear him whispering to invisible troops. Farmers spoke of finding footprints near their fields, or missing food from their stores. Each encounter added to the myth. Onoda had become a relic of a vanished world, a soldier frozen in the amber of his own conviction. Despite years of solitude, he never considered surrender. He had promised Major Taniguchi that he would hold his position until given new orders, and to break that vow would mean betraying everything he believed in. The world outside could change, empires could fall, nations could rebuild, but Onoda's mission remained unchanged. In his mind, he was still fighting for his homeland, still serving his emperor, still standing against the enemies of Japan. It was this unyielding sense of duty, noble and tragic, that sustained him through hunger, fever, and grief. It gave him purpose when all logic said to give up. And though the world had forgotten him, Hiroo Onoda had not forgotten his orders. In the quiet darkness of the jungle, he still saw himself as a guardian of an empire that no longer existed, the last soldier of a war that time itself could not end. As Hiroo Onoda continued his lonely vigil in the jungles of Lubang Island, the rest of the world moved on. The war he still fought existed now only in history books and fading memories. Japan had been rebuilt from ashes into a prosperous nation. The American occupation had ended in 1952, and the once devastated empire had transformed into a democracy filled with skyscrapers, neon lights, and bustling cities. The horrors of World War II were giving way to a new era of peace and technology. But Onoda knew nothing of this. To him, Japan was still at war, still resisting the Allies, still waiting for the Emperor's final call to arms. While Tokyo entered the modern age, Onoda remained trapped in 1945. The gap between his reality and the world's grew impossibly wide. In his mind, the war's front lines had merely shifted. When he saw airplanes flying high above the island, he assumed they were Japanese reconnaissance planes, part of a new campaign. When he found unfamiliar brands of food or bottles washed ashore, he concluded they were Allied rations, not realizing they came from the peacetime trade routes of a new global economy. Every detail that contradicted his belief was rationalized as an enemy trick. In the early 1960s, efforts to locate him intensified. Over the years, the Philippine government had received countless reports of sightings. A lone figure in tattered khaki, moving silently through the jungle, armed with a rifle. Patrols sent to find him always came back empty-handed. Even when the Japanese embassy became involved, dropping leaflets with photographs of his family and letters pleading for him to come home, Onoda saw only deception. The handwriting might have resembled his brother's, the language might have sounded genuine, but he found tiny inconsistencies and convinced himself they were proof of forgery. "The Americans are clever," he would mutter to himself. "They'll stop at nothing to trick us." Decades of isolation had reinforced an ironclad paranoia. The longer he survived, the more convinced he became that his mission was still vital. If Japan had truly surrendered, he reasoned, surely the enemy would have invaded the homeland. But since no reinforcements ever came, the war must still be ongoing. To Onoda, logic bent itself around duty. The Emperor's order was the only truth that mattered. In Japan, his story periodically reappeared in newspapers. Reporters called him the ghost soldier, the forgotten warrior, or the man who refused to surrender. At first, these reports stirred sympathy, then disbelief. By the 1960s, few believed anyone could have survived that long in such conditions. Japan was thriving under the so-called economic miracle, exporting cars and televisions across the world. A new generation had grown up in peace, untouched by the memories of war. For them, Onoda was a legend, a relic from an era they barely understood. But to the people of Lubang, he was not a legend. He was a very real threat. Every few months, livestock would vanish, crops would burn, or shots would ring out at night. The locals had grown used to living with this unseen presence in the mountains. Parents warned their children not to wander too far. Farmers worked in groups, fearful of encountering the Japanese bandit. In reality, Onoda saw these acts not as aggression, but as small tactical maneuvers, sabotage missions meant to disrupt enemy supplies. By the late 1960s, Onoda had been alone for nearly a decade. He was 47 years old, but his life had stood still since he was 22. His uniform, though patched with plant fibers and faded to brown, was still worn with pride. His rifle, a Type 99 Arisaka, was carefully cleaned and oiled using animal fat and banana leaves. He maintained strict discipline, following the routines drilled into him decades before: weapon maintenance, reconnaissance patrols, and written reports of his operations. To him, this was not madness, it was honor, yet Even the strongest faith began to strain under the weight of time. At night, he would sometimes wonder about his homeland. What had become of his family? Did Japan still fight? Had the emperor survived the bombing? These questions haunted him, but he would push them aside, afraid that doubt would weaken his resolve. I cannot give in, he told himself. If I stop believing, the war will truly be lost. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, search parties tried once more to bring him home. Japanese officials, journalists, and even former soldiers ventured into the Lubang jungles, calling his name through loudspeakers. They promised him safe passage, offered photographs, and carried letters from his aging family. But Onoda avoided them all. He knew their uniforms were different, their speech strange. They could not be true soldiers of the emperor. No Japanese officer would surrender, he thought. These men must be imposters. As the world entered the era of color television and space exploration, Onoda remained in the shadows, hunting wild animals and cooking over a small fire. He had missed the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the birth of the atomic age. Time itself had become meaningless. To him, the outside world was still divided between the Japanese Empire and the enemy forces. The story of his continued resistance fascinated historians and journalists alike. They debated whether it was heroism or tragedy. Some saw Onoda as the embodiment of the samurai spirit, loyal beyond reason. Others pitied him as a man imprisoned by obsolete ideals. Yet both views captured a truth about him. His faith in duty was absolute, and so, while Japan reached the height of its post-war prosperity, Hiroo Onoda remained a solitary figure in a decaying uniform, still patrolling the jungle for enemies who no longer existed, still waiting for the order that would finally set him free. In 1974, nearly 3 decades after World War II had ended, the unthinkable happened. Hiroo Onoda was finally found. His discovery would shock the world, a haunting reminder that the echoes of the war still lingered in forgotten corners of the earth. The man who had lived through monsoons, hunger and isolation, was about to be confronted by a reality he could no longer deny. But even then, Onoda was not ready to surrender. His loyalty ran too deep, his conviction too absolute. It would take more than words to convince him that the empire he served had long ceased to exist. It began with a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki. Suzuki was 24 years old, a restless spirit, a dreamer who longed to find something extraordinary in a world that had grown too ordinary. He told his friends, half-jokingly, that he was setting out to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. Many laughed, but Suzuki meant every word. He had read old reports of Onoda's sightings on Lubang Island and was fascinated by the idea of a man still fighting a war from the past. In February 1974, Suzuki traveled to the Philippines and began his search, armed with little more than a camera, basic supplies, and an unshakable determination. Suzuki trekked into the dense forests where others had failed. Locals warned him about the ghost soldier who attacked anyone who came too close, but Suzuki pressed on. After days of searching, he caught a glimpse of movement among the trees. A thin, wiry figure carrying a rifle, moving silently through the undergrowth. Suzuki raised his hands and called out in Japanese, "Onoda-san, the Emperor and Japan are worried about you." For a moment there was only silence. Then from behind a tree a voice replied, cautious, commanding, the voice of a man still in combat. "Who are you? How did you find me?" Suzuki answered calmly, speaking of his homeland, of Tokyo, of peace. Slowly Onoda emerged. His uniform was tattered but neatly maintained. His rifle, though old, was clean and ready to fire. His eyes were sharp, distrustful, but filled with curiosity. Over the following days, the two men spoke often. Suzuki stayed with Onoda in his camp, sharing food and stories. He showed him photographs of Japan's modern cities, gleaming cars, televisions, and skyscrapers. Onoda listened politely, but remained skeptical. "The Americans are cunning," he said. "They could have built all this to trick us." Suzuki realized that logic would not persuade him. Onoda needed something stronger, something that could pierce through decades of conditioning and solitude. He needed orders. When Suzuki returned to Japan, he contacted the government and explained what he had found. News of Onoda's survival spread rapidly, captivating the Japanese public. Newspapers called it the miracle of Lubang. Television crews prepared to document the event. But Suzuki made one thing clear: Onoda would not come out unless his commanding officer ordered him to. The government located Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the man who had given Onoda his final orders in 1944. Taniguchi, now a retired bookseller, was stunned to learn that his words had kept a man fighting for 29 years. The Japanese government arranged for Taniguchi to travel to the Philippines. On March 9, 1974, under the sweltering tropical sun, the former officer made his way into the jungle accompanied by local guides and Suzuki. When Onoda finally stepped out of the forest, it was as if time had folded in on itself. Two men meeting again, one still a soldier, the other long since a civilian. Onoda stood at attention, saluting. His uniform hung loose on his frame, his sword still sheathed at his side. Taniguchi read aloud the new orders prepared by the Japanese government. The war ended on August 15, 1945. The Imperial Army has been dissolved. You are to cease all combat activities and report to the nearest command post. For a moment the jungle was silent. Then Onoda's hands began to tremble. He lowered his rifle, staring into the distance as if trying to see the years he had lost. Slowly he bowed his head and said, "The Emperor's orders have been received. I will obey." That evening Onoda emerged from the jungle for the first time in 29 years. He wore his faded uniform and carried his sword, his rifle, and the 500 rounds of ammunition he had preserved with meticulous care. He surrendered his weapon to the Philippine authorities, though President Ferdinand Marcos granted him a full pardon, recognizing that Onoda had believed he was still at war. The next day, reporters crowded the area, cameras flashing as the long-lost soldier saluted one final time. The world was mesmerized. Photographs of Onoda, gaunt, disciplined, eyes hollow from decades of solitude, filled newspapers across the globe. Japan welcomed him as a hero, a symbol of unyielding loyalty and endurance. Yet behind the admiration lay a deeper tragedy. Onoda had lost nearly half his life to a war that had ended before he even knew it. The world he returned to was unrecognizable. Neon lights, modern technology, a Japan that had renounced the very militarism he had lived for. And yet to the end, Onoda felt no anger. "I was a soldier," he said in an interview years later. "I was taught to follow orders, and I did." For him, the surrender was not defeat, as it was completion. The war that had imprisoned him for 3 decades was finally, truly over. When Hiroo Onoda returned to Japan in 1974, he stepped into a nation that no longer resembled the country he had once fought for. Neon signs replaced bombed-out ruins, bustling crowds filled the streets where once there had been rubble, and the cries of air raid sirens had long been replaced by the hum of trains and the chatter of modern life. The rising sun he had sworn to defend had risen again, but not in the way he imagined. The Japan he had dreamed of serving had evolved into a peaceful, democratic society that had left its wartime identity behind. For Onoda, it was like waking from a dream, or perhaps falling into one. As he disembarked from the plane, thousands gathered to see him. Cameras flashed, news anchors narrated breathlessly, and curious citizens held signs welcoming him home. They expected to see a broken man, but Onoda stood tall, his posture still military perfect, his eyes calm and unreadable. Dressed in his uniform, the same one he had worn into the jungle, he bowed deeply before the crowd. "I am sorry I took so long," he said quietly. In that moment, Japan saw not just a man but a mirror, reflecting both the nation's past and its transformation. In the following weeks, Onoda was overwhelmed by attention. Journalists followed him everywhere. Television crews begged for interviews. Publishers offered him book deals. Some hailed him as a hero, the embodiment of the Japanese spirit, loyal, disciplined, unyielding. Others viewed him as a tragic figure, a man so consumed by obedience that he had become trapped in time. Young people, who had grown up in peace and prosperity, struggled to understand how anyone could have lived in such complete isolation for nearly 30 years. For them, Onoda was both inspiring and alien. Despite the adoration, Onoda felt like a stranger in his own homeland. The values he had fought for, honor, sacrifice, duty to the emperor, had faded in post-war Japan. The army had been disbanded, and Article 9 of the new constitution forbade the nation from waging war. To Onoda, this pacifist identity felt hollow. "Japan has lost something," he told reporters. "We have wealth but no spirit." It was not arrogance that drove these words, it was sorrow. The discipline that had guided his survival now made it impossible for him to adjust. He had lived by a code that no longer existed. For months he struggled to adapt. He stayed with his family, who had long mourned him as dead. His younger brother, now middle-aged, tried to reconnect, but Onoda seemed detached, his thoughts still half in the jungle. He woke before dawn, exercised in silence and meticulously cleaned his surroundings. When he slept, he dreamt of Lubang, the rustle of leaves, the smell of wet earth, the tension of unseen enemies. Civilization felt too loud, too fast, too indulgent. In 1975, seeking meaning, Onoda traveled to Brazil, where many Japanese immigrants had settled after the war. There he tried his hand at cattle ranching, living close to nature but far from the expectations of fame. The open fields and quiet evenings offered him a semblance of peace. He later married a Japanese woman named Machi and began to rebuild a semblance of normalcy. Yet even in Brazil, the war's shadow followed him. He often spoke at schools and community events, urging young people to live with purpose. Every man should have something to live for, something he will never give up, he would say. His voice steady, his conviction intact. Years later, he returned to Japan once more, this time to dedicate himself to youth education. He founded the Onoda Nature School, where he taught survival skills, discipline, and perseverance. The forest taught me everything, he told his students. Patience, endurance, respect for life. If you know how to live in nature, you will never be defeated. To many, it seemed that Onoda had finally made peace with his past, transforming his experiences into lessons for the future. But beneath his calm demeanor, he remained haunted by questions. Had his loyalty been noble or tragic? Had his obedience been strength or blindness? He never expressed regret for his actions, but he often reflected on the weight of duty. I was a soldier, he once said. I was given an order and I obeyed it. If that was a mistake, it was not mine alone. These words encapsulated his unbreakable faith in the code that had defined his life and the tragedy of how deeply that faith had imprisoned him. When Onoda passed away in 2014 at the age of 91, Japan mourned him not only as a man, but as a symbol, the last soldier of a vanished empire. His life had spanned the rise and fall of militarist Japan, the devastation of war, and the rebirth of a peaceful nation. To some, he was the ultimate example of loyalty. To others, a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind obedience. Yet perhaps both were true. In the end, Hiroo Onoda's story stands as one of the most extraordinary human sagas of the 20th century, a man who fought a war long after it ended, who lived by honor even when the world around him changed beyond recognition, and who reminded humanity that conviction, once set too deeply, can outlast even history itself.